may seem like an impossible question to answer, but it's being asked more and more, with more and more urgency. How does the criminal justice system treat people, both victims and defendants? Does it treat rich better than poor? Men better than women? Blacks and people of color worse than whites? Is the criminal justice system fair? Today on the West Wing Companion, I'm really excited to chat with two people who are on the front lines of that conversation. Alalay Kianersi was the prosecutor on the infamous Brock Turner sexual assault case. The case made Turner, who was a Stanford swimmer, a household pejorative, personifying privilege and providing a powerful anecdote for those who believe that color and socioeconomic status are a get-out-of-jail-free card. It also made a bright star out of the victim in the case, the artist previously known as Emily Doe. The young Palo Alto woman wrote a famous victim impact statement describing her outrage and pain and ultimately resiliency, and followed it up with a best-selling book called Know My Name. Her name is Chanel Miller, and Alalay will speak about her advocacy, Chanel's unique charisma and creativity, and a friendship that bloomed out of court. But first, we'll speak with Dan Okonkwo, who was feeling out of his element when he and a handful of other Santa Clara prosecutors touched down in Montgomery, Alabama a few weeks ago. He'd never been to the Deep South, and as a black man, it wasn't the first place he would pick for a junket or a jaunt. This was the point. DA Jeff Rosen was sending his entire executive staff to Alabama to visit civil rights museums, iconic places in civil rights history, to see for themselves the scars of American racism through the lens of the criminal justice system. Dan, welcome.
Good morning.
Was it what you expected?
I didn't know what to expect, to be honest. I'd grown up in New York City, the bubble that it is, amazing childhood, but I remembered stories my mother had told me over the years as young children, with my sister and I growing up with my mother, her concerns about going into the South, anywhere near the South.
Right.
And I never took, as a young child, those stories seriously. I didn't really understand why she had such strong feelings. I remember a baseball trip my high school took to North Carolina, I think my junior year in high school. I don't know if my mom slept the whole time that we were in North Carolina. And I'd been to South Carolina before as an adult, but to resort areas, and really not the same flavor of the South that you find in Alabama or Mississippi, for example. I honestly didn't know what to expect, and I don't think that I was prepared for the visceral feelings of feeling unsafe. And for me, I won't say it turned my world upside down, but it was, I've been to places all over the world and had safety issues, but never have I felt that kind of deep feeling of a kind of sadness from the idea that I might be a target or focused on because of my race.
Sure.
And that was eye-opening.
What can you describe some specific examples of that, or powerful moments during the trip that really just hit you where you live?
There were a lot of powerful moments on the trip, but one, we were driving to Selma. We went in a van, most of us on the trip went to go see the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I will say the remains of Selma, which is a shell of what it used to be. And I remember as we were driving, I believe on the way to Selma, truck rolled by us, and on the license plate was the Confederate flag. And I just, you're confronted with the reality. It's like you understand that there's racism in society. You understand, personal stories dealing with racism. But for a group of people to embrace a history of racism and racial violence, to me is unfathomable. I can't understand it. And for me, it was troubling. Personally, I mean, I didn't feel personally at risk at that moment. But I kind of understand what you see in the news about Confederate statues and the Confederate flag still being flown in the South. But when you're in the South and actually see it and understand that these people are using it as a symbol of their own racial hatred, they're probably to embrace their own inferiority complexes, whatever their state of mind is. It still has the same message it had 50, 75 years ago, which is to instill fear in people of color,
Right.
because I understand what those people are capable of.
Were there ever any moments during the trip where you felt uplifted, or you felt like there was some sort of light at the end of the tunnel, or positive moments at all?
For me, the highlight of my trip was the King Memorial Church on Dexter Avenue. And we got to stand. It is still a functioning church. It's a memorial, but it's still a functioning church. And the staff there, the docents that run the church for the tours were amazing. And they still allow people to walk up to the pulpit and to place their hands where Reverend Martin Luther King placed his hands during his sermons. For me, that was one of the most powerful moments in my life. I didn't realize until I'd stepped off the stage, but my eyes were filling with tears and I could not control it. And that was powerful. I mean, MLK was a giant, still a giant, and I certainly don't feel worthy. I'm not MLK. I can only dream to have the impact that he did, but any little thing that I can do makes me feel as though I'm also, in the words of the Equal Justice Initiative, a warrior for justice. And that was a huge moment for me.
On that note, some might say that the racism that you saw directly woven into the Alabama criminal justice system on that trip is an outgrowth of that specific place, right? You're in charge of issuing thousands of criminal cases a year here in Santa Clara County. Let me just ask it straight out. Is there racism, explicit, implicit, you name it, in our system here in Northern California?
Complicated question, but easy question. There is implicit bias everywhere. Even people who don't recognize on a conscious level that they act in racist ways. They impose their bias on other people. For example, in policing, question is, for example, brown people of color, are they stopped more often than non-brown people? Let's just say white people, shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is yes. I just attended recently a presentation by the Computational Policy Lab at Stanford, and they had done an empirical study with over 100 million traffic stops in the United States, and not surprisingly, I found that if you are still a person of color, you are more likely to be pulled over by the police. Implicit bias, I think, is probably the largest factor. Maybe I'm being hopeful or naive, but I don't think express racism is rampant. Yes, there are clearly individuals in law enforcement who are biased in a non-implicit way. So yes, I mean, we live in the United States, so anyone is going to bring with them some implicit bias. What we do, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to have that downstairs on the issuing team, is to try my best to make my team members cognizant of the fact that we don't control who the police bring to us. And so it's our responsibility, our job, to make sure that the implicit bias or bias of the officer or agencies that bring us cases is not expressed through our decisions that we make in charging cases. So it's important, and I bring it up every training I do with my team and with others, that they always think about that when they're reviewing cases. Now, that's not going to stop you from, if violent crime is committed, you're going to charge it appropriately. But there are a lot of cases that we see where there are things that we can do to, I think, balance the scales. And that might be somebody with no criminal record, not a violent offense. Perhaps you give them the benefit of the doubt. The office has policies which have been put in place, which I think make our job a lot easier, my job a lot easier. One of the biggest ones is the drug policy now, where the first 2 or 3 drug offenses are not prosecuted, and we wait for the third. I think that has had a huge impact on communities of color, and certainly lower socioeconomic groups have benefited largely by not being subject to incarceration on every simple drug possession. I think that's had a huge impact.
Right. I'm really happy that you're doing what you're doing.
So am I.
Thank you. Welcome, LA.
Hi, Sean.
Simple question. What's Chanel like in real life?
Chanel is very kind, sweet, bubbly almost. She's very thoughtful and smart. She thinks about what she's going to say. I think that's why she's so articulate when things actually come out of her mouth.
Right. When you first met her to now, have you seen her change? Have you seen her grow up to a certain extent, because she was rather young when the trial started?
I think so. I definitely have seen her evolve in terms of how she's handled being a victim and a survivor. When I first met her, she almost was like wide-eyed and scared. And now she's taken over the world. So I can't say that I've ever seen that experience with any other victim. I have seen other victims take back the power and, when we get justice for them. But Chanel has not only done that 10,000-fold, she's become this spokesperson for all survivors and a beacon for everybody. So it's really just amazing to see, and her transformation and her strength and her courage and her continued just shooting for the stars. She's changed, obviously, and I'd like to ask you if you've changed. Obviously, we all change over time, but did your experience with Chanel, your experience with the Proctor case, your experience with all the other stuff that went around the Proctor case change you, either as a prosecutor, as a woman, as a person? Absolutely. That's a really good question. I was just doing an interview with a bunch of high school students, and one of the questions they asked me was, what would you do differently now that you didn't do when you handled this case? And it was like, oh, that's a really good question. And I think this is important. When I first got the case, there was a few days just through the procedural aspects of when we received the report, filed the case, and then the arraignment would have been 2 days later. And I remember calling Chanel the day of the arraignment, because we were going to have a press conference, and I wanted to warn her, you're going to see me on the news, we're going to need to meet. And for me at that time in my career, obviously as a sexual assault prosecutor, you want to talk to the victims, you want to do it early, but just through the natural wave of things, it doesn't happen until after the first court appearance. Sometimes it takes a few weeks. And so from my perspective at the time, I was like A+ prosecutor contacting her before the arraignment. But reading her letter, reading her book, seeing how that week lag with the case having so much intense media interest really affected her, and it really was, added to the uncertainty and added to the trauma. So it's changed me. Her book has changed me. Getting to know her has changed me, and how I think about the victim's perspective, how the case affects the victim, from the unknown to the delays, just how you treat the victims. Obviously, I gave her A+ service in terms of, victim assistance and all that, but, the little things that you do, and as a prosecutor, you're so focused on getting the right results, and sometimes you forget about how much every little detail can affect a victim.
Similar to that, did you recognize yourself in Chanel's book? Did you recognize the criminal justice system in Chanel's book? Did you recognize the players that you know so well in Chanel's book?
Yeah, I recognized a lot of them. I think, but what was also how it, affected me and made me think about being a prosecutor and how I prep victims from this point forward is, she felt very personally attacked by every question the defense attorney asked her. And of course, because the defense's job was to poke holes in her case and to make it seem like this was regret, not rape. And the defense attorney is Mike Armstrong, one of the best attorneys in the county. And, for her, she felt like, he was so attacking her, and he was doing his job, but he did it from my perspective in a he could have been worse. We've seen worse actors in terms of defense attorneys who just are very disrespectful towards victims. And it's interesting to see that from her perspective, he was the worst. But from my perspective, I've seen much worse defense attorneys in the way they engage and interact with victims. So it was really eye-opening to see. We know that they feel personally attacked when they're on the stand. But even under the better circumstances, it's so traumatic for them.
Did you read anything in Chanel's book that surprised you, that shocked you, that you didn't recognize at all? Other than the perspective that, your words carried so much weight, or the timing of your words carried so much weight.
I was really surprised. Well, it's, again, along those same lines. This case was arraigned on January 18th, 2015. The trial was March of 2016. And from a normal perspective, everyone in the media keeps asking me, why did that take so long? For Chanel, it felt like an eternity. But from my perspective, in what we are used to, for better or worse, that actually was fast.
Right.
To have a case from arraignment to sentencing take a year and a half is rare. So even though I talked to her about that, and I kind of, every time we had an explanation for, why there was a continuance, and the fact that the case actually went pretty fast from every aspect, but for her, it's still, it's personal to them. She has no other experience being a victim of a sexual assault, right?
Sure.
So this is her first foray with the criminal justice system, and it was not good in that regard. But from what I know, and I think she criticized, or she felt in the book, criticism towards the rape kit taking some time to be processed. But what she doesn't know is, because of the intense media scrutiny of this case, this rape kit was processed much faster than many others, because we were eager to be ready for trial and to have this case go forward in a more expeditious way. But again, even from her perspective, it was just too long. That's something that was eye-opening for me, and I think we should all think about, how victims, deal with the delays.
Sure. Chanel's words obviously have resonated with millions of people, certainly resonated powerfully with sexual assault victims and victims of all crime. Is Chanel a prototypical sexual assault victim?
I mean, that's hard to say.
Is there such a thing?
No, there's not. I mean, we experience victims of all walks of life. The vast majority of our sexual assault cases are children, people who are young, people from varying types of families. Sexual assault is one of those things that it knows no boundaries. Any type of person, a rich person, a poor person, an orphan, a prostitute. I mean, there's no prototypical victim. One of the things that, was helpful, I think, in the case is that while Chanel was very intoxicated, she presented in a way that wasn't her actual normal habit. But we have victims who are homeless, who are just known drunks, who are prostitutes. And so it's, with every case, you have to really adjust your expectations and how you proceed with it, to make sure you can hopefully get justice for every type of victim.
I guess the last question I have about Chanel is, what is her legacy? What is, not that it's done, but what is the legacy of the Brock Turner case? If there's a positive legacy to the Brock Turner case, what is that?
I think there's a lot of positive aspects to this case. I think it reframed the conversation about sexual assault. I think her legacy is that she put the victims of intoxicated rape on a different level, where people are now treating them with more respect than they did in the past. Her legacy is that her words changed the law to treat victims of sexual assault who are intoxicated or unconscious the same as if they were conscious. I mean, there's so many legacies that she has unintentionally, by the way. She didn't sign up for this. She didn't know she was doing this when she wrote that letter. But I think also, her words and her impact is to teach people about sexual assault, to prevent it. I just got off a FaceTime interview with a high school class of 50 students who are all reading her letter, who are having the conversations about consent and about, what to do, how to prevent this from happening in high school, and her words resonated with them. So, her legacy is just amazing, and how she's been able to impact the world in a positive way in reframing the conversation about sexual assault.
Thank you, and will you thank her for us?
I will.